make a video recording of our talk. So if it were to show a picture of us, it was taking pictures of us before.
Technology is fun.
We love it.
Yeah.
Okay, not our problem. We tried really hard. You saw us. I don't know the answer to that. Maybe
We'll
it's not
be
showing
able to
us.
hear our voices.
They'll be able to hear our lovely mellifluous tones. All right, so thank you very much for being at our very first session of the day. So again, like you were all here, but I'm Patrick Gabridge, a playwright and writer and producer for Plays in Place. And we're going to talk a little bit about using the Hancock Door to unlock unheard historical voices.
And my name is Courtney O'Connor, especially for those of you who may have come in late. I am a theater director here in town. I'm the associate artistic director at the Lyric Stage Company. I teach at Emerson College, and I have worked with Pat and the Old State House and the Bostonian Society on some productions, which we will talk about in a moment.
Yeah. So our story starts with Thomas Hancock, who born in 1703, really interesting guy. So he's a really interesting example of an American self-made man. He comes from not a prominent family, but his father was a minister. He didn't have enough money to send both sons to Harvard. So his son John, there's a lot of John Hancocks in this story. So the great-grandpa's named John. The other guy, Thomas Hancock's brother's named John. So Thomas Hancock doesn't get to go to school. He doesn't really care. He's really a hands-on kind of guy, and he is apprenticed as a bookbinder in Boston around the age of 15. And it's kind of cool. If you go to the Old State House, they have an exhibit around Hancock's Door, which is what our thing is related to. But there is a case with the original document where his apprenticeship document is there, which is really, I don't know, it's one of my favorite documents in that room right now, because it's so cool. And 1718, it talks all the things he can't do. He can't do card playing or dice or drinking or fornicating, or there's a whole list of things you can't do when you're an apprentice, it turns out. But the apprenticeship turned out really well for him. It was a 7-year apprenticeship. I can't remember if he left early or not. But he's an apprentice bookbinder. He turns out to be really good, not just at bookbinding, but at business. So he kind of starts his business for himself, ends up buying its competitors, and pretty soon he's like the Amazon.com of colonial Massachusetts. So he's selling whale oil, he's got 4 or 5 ships plying the Atlantic, he's selling rum. He is not directly involved in the slave trade, though he's certainly involved in the triangle trade. So he makes a lot of his money as a war supplier. So he's supplying the British Army with money when their various wars. And actually it's terrible, but it's wonderful. He makes a lot of his money in the War of Jenkins' Ear, which it's weird to like the name of a war, but just the fact that there's a war named the War of Jenkins' Ear is just, I was like, what? But yeah, it turns out there was a war. The British sailor claimed that some Spaniard clipped off his ear a couple years later, and that gave him an excuse to go to war in Florida and beyond, and Oglethorpe invades Spanish Florida, and it turns into a whole big King George's War later. But the War of Jenkins' Ear helped Thomas Hancock make a lot of his money. And it's interesting that, like, the War of Jenkins' Ear, it actually gets a lot of New Englanders involved. There's actually 1,000 New Englanders who go sign up for this war. And there's only, in Boston at this time, there's only 15,000 people. So picture out of New England, 1,000 people going to get in the fight and make some money.
Half of that 15,000 was young children.
Right. So yeah, a lot of the men went. By the time he's in his 20s, he's being super successful. And by his 30s, he's one of the richest men in Boston. Kind of an interesting guy. And he's very involved politically, so he's a selectman, and he is involved he ends up living, as you will see, in this fabulous house that he builds right on the top of Beacon Hill. And so he ends up being involved, like he dredges the frog pond and cleans up the common and stuff like this, because he lives right across the street from the common. It's his front yard. In the early 1730s, he buys a big parcel of land, a couple of acres or more, up on the top of Beacon Hill. And nobody lives there. Right there at that time, there's a big beacon that's an alert beacon that you could alert other towns if there was an attack. So if you ever seen Lord of the Rings movie, and they light the flames of Gondor, well, there was one of those here in Boston on Beacon Hill, and that's why it's named Beacon Hill, because there was a beacon right there. So yeah, so it's right there if I'm not turned around too much. It's 1736, so he's like 33 years old. He's incredibly rich, and he decides to build this big house, and everybody's like, "You're crazy! Why are you building your house way out of town?" But he's like, "Well, I like the view. I can see the ocean. I can see Boston Common, which is a cow field at that time." And he actually doesn't have a westward neighbor until 1768, and John Singleton Copley actually ends up being his first neighbor to the west down the hill. Yeah, so if you're going down Beacon Hill, he doesn't have any downside neighbors till then. The builder was Joshua Blanchard, and it was made of Medford granite. Everyone says it's Quincy granite, but this was made from Medford granite, and it's decorated with sandstone from Connecticut, so brownstone decorations. You can't really see super well on this drawing of it. But it was a rock solid house made of stone, and later on it ends up having additional wings and a ballroom added. So, but it's quite the stately thing, and he's furnishing it with furnishings from England, and it's got like 58 windows, which is a big deal back then because glass is really expensive, and when there's riots in Boston, as there tend to be, didn't happen to him, but like Thomas Hutchinson, people come along and break your windows, and it's kind of a pain. Anyway, he builds this great house, and which ends up becoming really important in Boston. So you've kind of heard of this guy, John Hancock, this guy. And this is the Copley portrait, which is kind of funny to think that he was their neighbor.
Yeah.
I never really thought about that. Like, oh yeah, you just kind of go up the street. That's pretty easy.
Come on over for dinner, paint a portrait, I'll call it even.
Yeah. So this John Hancock, the one we know, the one with the big signature, he was born to Thomas Hancock's brother, John, who's a minister, like the senior John, and the senior John lived in Lexington. Our John's father, John, lived in Quincy and Braintree for quite a while. And so he was born to Thomas and his mother, and but our John, the big John, his father died in 1744. And so he had no father. Mother has a bunch of kids, trying to figure out how to support them. Well, Thomas and his wife Lydia come along, and they're like, "We don't have any children. We want to take yours." So they adopt.
But not all of them.
Not all of them, just this one. So it's just kind of odd how kids could get passed along in families, right? So they have the means to take care of and educate a child. They would like to have an heir for the House of Hancock, which is turned into this huge conglomerate. And they're like, we'd like John to come live with us. So he does. So around the age of 7 or 8, he is taken into the household and becomes essentially their son. Though his mother still lives around and still is, and that all plays into their much later life, but we won't go into that too much. So Thomas takes John in, teaches him the business, sends him over to England to start making connections, because remember, this is a time when commerce moves pretty slowly, right? So people are moving back and forth across the ocean, so your personal connections are really important. So, you get to meet people, you'll send somebody abroad for a few years, and they'll, he had a really good time when he was there. And he wrote a letter, he's like, "I'm sorry I'm spending so much money on clothes and stuff, but I can't help myself. And I'm really rich, so it's okay." And that's how John was. He was something of a dandy.
He was quite the fashionista.
He was. If you go to the old State House, is the jacket on display now? It is downstairs, right?
I believe the replica jacket is on display.
Right,
yeah.
so he really liked velvet. He's got this great purple velvet jacket that there's a replica on display now. He drove around in a canary yellow coach. He was
His favorite
happy.
color was purple.
Yeah, so.
And and they also have on display in the not rep hall, the council chamber room, Dorothy, who we'll get to in a moment, but her wedding slippers, the shoes that he bought for her from England, and they have the letters where he's writing to her, and he's like, "I don't think you understand how special these shoes are. They're made from this silk. They were really expensive. You should love them." I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but that's the sentiment, is like, you're not getting how good these are.
There's a story I'll tell later about him and clothes, yeah. But he takes over, and he does a pretty good job. He takes well to the business and understands kind of the way commerce worked is so interesting back then, because they're always trying to anticipate the market. So it might be this year we're doing whale oil because we think we can corner the market on it, but this year it might be, supplies for trappers up in Maine. So they only get a limited number of ships. But sadly, Thomas Hancock dies in 1764 at the old State House, known as the Town House back then, and so all his stuff, all his materials go to Lydia, his wife, who promptly then signs everything over to John. So the deal is, he'll take care of her for the rest of his life. And John gets 100,000 pounds, which is a lot of money, plus an enormous amount of real estate, plus a house at Hancock. So he is suddenly the richest man in Boston in 1764. And if you think about kind of what's going on in Boston around 1764, things are about to hit the fan, right? The Stamp Act comes in 1765. Things get really ugly in Boston for the next 20 years. So it's a kind of an interesting time to suddenly be catapulted into great wealth and have a certain amount of power and political power that you can take advantage of. And he definitely does take advantage of it in that, he wants to be liked, he wants to have influence over what he's doing. It's a good business thing for him, too. He's a businessman, first and foremost. And that's partly why we don't hear as much from him as we do from Jefferson or the various Adamses. He's not an intellectual. He's not trying to, he doesn't have the idea of starting an entire new nation. That's not what he's about. However, what he does, he's particularly good at building relationships with people. He's very popular politically. And so, he's able to accomplish a lot. Obviously, he goes on to sign the Declaration of Independence. We've all seen his big, bold signature, which people think is just, he has an enormous ego, that's why his is the biggest. It's not exactly true. That might have been partly true. He certainly had a big ego, but they all did. Don't kid yourself about who these men are. They wanted to make history. They were there for a reason, okay? John Hancock, he signs that paper in July of 1776. He's the only one to sign it at that time. Everybody else doesn't sign it until August. So
he's the president
of the Continental Congress. So he's signing all the documents that are coming through. So it's actually big and centrally placed because his is the only one for a little while. So in some ways, he actually takes the biggest risk of all because his name's the only one on it for a little while. And they get hanged for signing this. So John Hancock he's portrayed as something of a dilettante sometimes and a dandy, and he's all those things. But he's a really shrewd businessman. In the Continental Congress, what's interesting about him is that he's elected many times to be president and has trouble serving later on because he's sick a lot. He has gout in a really bad way and other health ailments. But he is easily accepted by the planter class because he is a rich aristocrat and newish money. So the Virginians love this guy. They hate Sam Adams and John Adams. And by the time they're done with the early Continental Congresses, even John Adams and Sam Adams hate John Hancock. But so they pass a resolution of appreciation at some point in the Congress. It's a little later on. And Massachusetts is the only people that reject it. Everybody else likes him. So he's kind of an interesting guy. And he ends up becoming the first governor of Massachusetts. So he's immensely popular locally, and he's generous with his wealth. So in the Stamp Act, when there's a big celebration after they repeal the Stamp Act, he opens a pipe of Madeira, which is a huge cask of really expensive wine out on the common, and the whole town gets drunk. He is helping finance a lot of the underground movements that are making things happen. 1768, things get really ugly in Boston again. Partly the reason why British troops occupy Boston in 1768 is because of Hancock smuggling with the Lydia and the Liberty. And we'll actually talk about one of the people we're talking about that's unheard is involved in the Lydia. So the other person that we want to talk about is Dorothy Quincy, or Dolly Hancock, as she becomes known. And so she was born to Edmund Quincy in Braintree, who's part of the kind of established Quincy family. And her father was actually sometime business partner with Thomas Hancock. So there's already a relationship there. Everybody knew each other back then. It was a small town, and if you were rich, kind of hung out a little bit. When Dolly's mother dies in 1769, John's Aunt Lydia takes her in and says, honey, you come live with us. I'll take good care of you. And by the way, I'm hoping you're going to marry my nephew. But it takes a while. It takes until 1775 for them to finally, I think John's kind of having fun being single, straight or gay, we don't know. And Dolly's, I think they liked each other, but they're, she wasn't easy, she did not want to be ruled by anybody.
Yeah, there is the story, and you may be able to tell it better than we are, but when during I think getting ready for the Battle of Lexington, or one of the times when they were supposed to go on the run, and John was like, come on, Dolly, we have to go, and she essentially said to him, we're not married yet, you can't tell me where to go.
Yeah,
I will go where I want.
She's like, you're not
I know,
the
right?
boss.
She's like, go Dolly.
She's like, you're not the boss of me.
Yeah.
I love
Girl
Dolly.
after my own heart.
I know. And so this is a Singleton Copley portrait done while she was still Dorothy Quincy, actually. So this is a few years before she was married, which it's at the MFA. It's exquisite. I love her. I think she's awesome. So in 1775, they get married on the run. So the Battle of Lexington and Concord has happened. The troops weren't really coming for Adams and Hancock, but they kind of were. It depends who you ask. But there's definitely a price on Hancock's head. He was definitely, by 1775, known as one of the key figures in the looming revolution. So the British would love to capture and kill this guy. And so Dorothy has to flee Boston kind of with them. They get left behind in the Clark Hancock house, which you can go see. It's been moved, but it is in Lexington. So she actually witnesses the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the Battle of Lexington, from her bedroom window at the Clark Hancock house. So she's right there. She's like there from the beginning. But they end up fleeing. They get married in Connecticut at the Thaddeus Burr House, which is kind of cool. I love that. So supposedly Aaron Burr was kind of hanging around, and Aaron Burr's something of a ladies' man. Even if irrespective of Hamilton, he really was. And so so Lydia's like, well, I really want John and Dolly to get married, so you're getting married now. So she's like, okay, this is happening, because there's like Dolly and Aaron, like a few glances, like we don't want that happening. So they get married, and that was kind of fun. But so they go back and they live in the Hancock Mansion. They have to leave it for a little while during the war. Sadly, Lydia dies at the Thaddeus Burr House, actually, in 76, under certain circumstances. So this is kind of a cool picture. So this is taken in the 1860s. But what you can see, there are people on that balcony. And those are descendants of Hancock, which is kind of cool. So that's the real house. So John dies in 1793, and a good chunk of the fortune that he'd inherited is gone by that point. Some say he spent at least $100,000 on the war. So he paid for a lot of what happened. And we kind of lose track of kind of like how the war was financed, because there weren't like banks that were willing to loan us lots of money to this thing that doesn't exist, right? So there are people who are giving some of their private money, and Hancock was one of them, and he was generous to people. He dies without a will, so got really confusing, like who's gonna get it. So Dolly gets it for her lifetime, but there's a bit of squabbling that goes on. Dolly gets remarried in 1796 to one of the captains who used to sail for John Hancock, James Scott. And so she goes and lives in Portsmouth, New Hampshire for a little while, but then returns after he dies in 1809. And she lives there till 1816. And then she's an old lady by then, and it's too much of a big house for her. So she's kind of ready to go somewhere else. So then nephews and descendants and Hancock's mom, they all fight over this house for the next 50 or 60 years. But it is eventually resolved. But in 1859, the last Hancock to own the house is done with it, dies. And so the estate offers it to sell it to the estate, because it's right up on Beacon Hill. Dolly had already sold off the meadow from behind the house, which forms the west wing of the current state house up there right now, a good chunk of the West Wing. So if you think about, you look at the big state house, had all, I'm not sure it had all been Hancock property, but definitely the west part of it had been Hancock property. But there was still a fair bit of, as today, political disagreement between the rural districts of Massachusetts and the urban districts of Massachusetts. So the rural districts are like, we don't want to pay $100,000 for some old house for the governor to live in. So you'll notice that Massachusetts does not have a governor's mansion, partly because they turned down the Hancock Mansion at that time. So the state can't buy it, they don't know what to do with it, so finally some developers, 2 merchants, end up buying the home, and they're gonna tear it down and turn it into, not condos, into townhouses, into brownstones. But it's like the same story that we have today, right? You're like, what's going on? So before it gets torn down, or is scheduled to be torn down. Oh, good. So young architect John Hubbard Sturgis creates a set of measured drawings. And what's kind of cool, they're very detailed, and they're actually the first full set of of measured drawings done in the Americas. We always think of kind of that this is normal, that you would have like these detailed measured drawings, right? But no, they didn't really use blueprints the way we do back then, and then this is of an existing house. And it was kind of cool, they had the inside and outside really well detailed. But people were trying to do the Bostonian thing. You know, we were civic-minded people. We're like, save the Boston Mansion, Hancock Mansion, but it didn't work. Every little bit piece gets auctioned off. And it's interesting because he was enormously popular as a politician, so people wanted bits and pieces of this house. So I mean, everything, and so the staircase is in a house in Marblehead, like today. And I think the external staircase is over, they say by the park by Jamaica Pond. I don't know, I haven't found it. But I think I know the one they're talking about, but I think I don't know if I believe that. Yeah, it was pretty interesting. If you go over there now, you can see bits and pieces of it. And the big bits and piece that's over at the old State House right now is the door. The front door from the Hancock Mansion ends up in the hands of the Bostonian Society around the turn of the 20th century, and has been in storage ever since, collecting dust. It may be displayed once or twice, because I haven't figured out where that sign was from.
Right.
But anyway, it's just gotten back out. We'll talk about that in a minute. So the cool thing was, it's terrible that the mansion was destroyed. Some people said it was like an act of modern vandalism at the time. It spurred a new wave of historic preservation in Boston. So the fact that we have the old State House today, that we have Old South, that we have the Paul Revere House, those are because of how appalled people were that the Hancock Mansion was torn down. Because it was this iconic symbol of Boston for so many people who lived here, and it was just gone, which was just terrible. Kind of the good news is that we had those measured drawings, so they could build a new one. So in Ticonderoga, the Historic Society there built a replica of the house, which, so who was from there?
Or who
had been there? You've
Yeah.
been there. Yeah, so that's the house. It's not exact. I think the measured drawings turned out to not have been 100% accurate, but it's pretty cool. I have not been, but I really want to go there. And it spurred a whole colonial revival movement, which was pretty fun. And so there's a house on Fairweather Street in Cambridge. You can see it from the old picture that Courtney found. The front entrance especially is very similar to what the original house had. This would be like a side view. So it's modified, but it's there. You can go see it now. And Bill Weld used to live in that house,
Governor
right?
Weld used to live. That used to be his house. So it was the governor's mansion at one point.
Right, his own mansion. So all that and the stuff around the Hancock Door leads us to the project that we're involved with, which is Cato and Dolly, a new play. So the door is on display at the museum, and the museum we worked with on this project, Blood on the Snow.
So last year, 2 years ago, we premiered Blood on the Snow, which was a new play by Patrick Gabridge, and it examined the events that took place the day after the Boston Massacre, when the representatives and the governor had to come together and decide how to bring peace to the town when the town was in unrest, and they were demanding the removal of the British troops. So at that point, the governor sort of negotiated, and again, in sort of this idea of whose stories are untold, we don't actually know what was said in that room. We don't know how the decisions were made, but the play sort of looked at how could we have come to this decision? What are some of the possible paths? So we did it in the council chamber of the old State House, which is where the meeting took place the day after the massacre. And we had a cast of 10 actors. We had full costumes, replica. It was a full production. Obviously, the set was already built for us, the old State House. But we worked as hard as we could to create an immersive experience for the audience, not in the way of, oh, here we're going to go up and have you talk about it, but you were seated sort of runway style right in there with them. So the furthest seat away was, probably about me to you, was the furthest seat away that anyone was. And so we ran that the first year for, for 4 weeks, and we sold out, I think, before we opened. So we brought it back last summer and sold for 12 weeks in a sold-out run.
So that was pretty much. So they thought, well, let's do another play. That was a good idea, I think.
That was a separate evening event. That was not part of sort of the museum's usual programming. That was a separate ticketed evening event that took place.
Yeah. And so the executive director there was kind of inspired by the story of this guy named George Robert Twelves Hughes, who was an old man by the early mid 1800s, and but he was kind of like this. Nat calls him like the Zelig of American history. So he was like at the massacre maybe, and he was at the Tea Party, and he was in the Revolution, and he was in all these different places. And this poor shoemaker, and kind of lives a hard life, but when he's in his 80s and 90s, he's kind of uncovered by some biographers who write these books. And these books are kind of formative in kind of the chronicle of American history in some way, of figuring out what defining the Boston Tea Party as the Boston Tea Party. But it was there's an interesting moment early on in this guy's story when he meets John Hancock. He's built him, he made him a pair of shoes, and Hancock invites him in for a New Year's Day toast, which is kind of this, there's a tradition of this kind of noblesse oblige kind of moment where you invite kind of the commoners in. And so anyway, Nat was really taken by this kind of social stratification that's showing up in this story, and then how it kind of flattens out a little bit, and how this guy's connected to that door. And that is what the door looks like. And so the question is, how can we write a play about a door? You can't.
Yeah, the answer is you cannot.
The answer is you don't do it. But they reached out to the North Bennett Street School to restore and clean this door, and to start building a display around it. You gotta hold it up somehow, right? And so what can we do? And they took it to the Restoration Carpentry program there, who does pretty amazing work. The Bostonian Society was not just interested in a typical kind of founding fathers, old white guys story, but like who else is in this household that we haven't heard of, that we can use the door to access these stories, and how can we use a play to kind of bring those to life? So they're building an exhibit around it called Through the Keyhole that is asking these questions of whose stories get told and whose objects do we preserve. But obviously we have this object preserved of this famous white guy, but there's still room for us to do other stuff.
And in the preservation of it, they didn't paint it.
Right, so the door is unmodified, it's just cleaned. And so this is us cleaning, not us, I got to clean like with a Q-tip, like a little bit. I have touched the door. It's a 270-year-old door, it's just a door. But it's cool, it's really cool. And so they had a historic paint expert in there to look it over, Sarah Chase, she knows a lot about paint. And so it was neat what they did, and then they built this really cool display to hold the door, which is, I love it.
It's all the original hinges and the locks and everything on it.
Yes, exactly. All the original hardware's there, and then they hand carved the supports and stuff. So that's a close-up of the sculpture of Hera that I watched them hand carve with chisels. It took forever.
They said it took about 100 hours for each of the two.
Post, wow. I'm not surprised. Yeah. And this is the interior side where essentially going to serve as the stage for our play. So our task was to write a 24 minutes, 24-minute play we had a limited cast, so we're gonna be like 2 actors that are gonna play a lot of different roles to tell some stories that you don't always hear. So what's cool is we got a lot of research from them, and my job in the course of about a month, because it was a very compressed time period, was to figure out who in this household do we know something about, who do we want to know about, what are the voices that we might want to hear. I was really taken with Dolly Hancock. We don't have a lot of letters from her. We have letters from John to her, mostly whining about, why don't you ever write to me? I think he was bored, he liked people paying attention to him, and she was having babies, and sometimes those babies died, and she just had a lot going on in her life. So, you know, and he's like, well, pay attention to me. So she, and want to know, like, what is it like to be in that household? Who could this person be? And so that's something for us to explore. That was the first voice. And the second voice I came across was this slave named Cato, which it's hard, you know, I'm trying to figure out like who the servants and slaves were in the house. It's actually easier to find information about slaves in some ways because they're documented in certain documents. So they might show up in tax records or in people's wills, where a paid servant may or may not. So in this particular case, I was able to find some things out about Cato, and he was involved in some really interesting stories that we get to tell in the play that may or may not be apocryphal, but we're going to say that they really happened. But we were able to find baptismal records for him and his children, and they all went to the same church. It's kind of interesting how slavery in New England, slavery is always horrible. It operated in a different mode than Southern slavery did because it's not on large plantations. There's not as much striation between levels of unfreedom, but there are definitely levels of unfreedom that are happening there. And your power structure that you depend on to live is very much based on the household that you're in. So, you know, the better, people are definitely concerned with freedom and unfreedom, but they're very concerned with autonomy in their lives, how much control they have over their ability to start a family or visit their family, or protect themselves from being sold or mistreated and things like that. So it's a really complicated time. But so Cato ends up being someone who's really interesting to me as someone whose voice we could pursue. And then I wrote a script as fast as I could.
It was really quickly written. And so then we began auditioning, like literally, I think Pat handed in the first draft of the script on a Friday, and we had auditions on Tuesday, which is incredibly quick. And what we decided was, because this play was going to be presented in a different way than Blood on the Snow. As I said, Blood on the Snow is a separate ticketed event in the evening. This play is presented during the day. It is part of your access to the museum. So it will perform every Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday at 11 o'clock, 12:30, and 2 o'clock. So it's a completely different way of putting a piece together, and it's going to run until the end of September. So what we needed to look at was that we might not be able to have just one set of actors, but that we might need more than that. So what we've wound up with is 2 Catos and 3 Dollys. We came up with a game in rehearsal. I don't know if anyone else was a fan when they were a child, home on sick days of The Price is Right, but I've created a new game. It's called Swap That Dolly. It's fabulous. But we did some workshops. We had various actors come in with us, work on the script, reading it, and Pat sort of shaping it further and adjusting it further as needed, because what's on the page and then what comes out always doesn't sound the same. So we made those adjustments so that we were able to go into rehearsal 2 weeks ago this Monday with our cast of actors. We had a stage manager and a costume designer, and now here we are with our 3 Dollys and our 2 Catos. The show opened yesterday.
Yep.
We're running this weekend as well, so all day, every day this weekend we're running, and we're swapping a Dolly every day. Our Cato on the end will be in for about the next month while the other Cato is out of town. But it's a real challenge putting this sort of structure together, but already, I think yesterday was our first day performing in front of an audience, and it was phenomenal to see the audience connecting with the story and with this exhibit in a very different and very palpable way than simply reading the materials and moving forward.
Exactly, and that's the thing. It's our goal is to really bring history to life for people in a way that's very human and connect these people together. And it is a very different piece from the Blood on Snow piece in that it's not a strict realistic piece, because we don't have we're not in the room where this happened. We just have the door behind us where it happened. So we're linking to this object. Kind of the interesting thing is historically that there are things in the play that actually did happen in that room, but we can't actually tie it in at that moment. So it's just a totally different kind of structure. If you've seen that play, this play is very different. It's like two people that each play. One guy plays, I think Cato plays 6 different roles, and Dolly plays 3.
It's also an interesting challenge when you are writing a play about a door, when you are not able to touch the door or to move the door.
We can't open the door, go through the door, or touch the door.
So there is a lot of talk about sort of the door and what happened around it and what it represented.
Door's metaphor.
But at no
but it's
time
a real
in the
door.
play are they able to actually touch the door or go through it. So we knew right away that we had to present this in a non-realistic style. So costumes are not period appropriate, but we use a lot of hats. And, we just sort of took it from there and ran with it.
It's a fun piece. There is a history camp special session tomorrow for the 12:30 show that I don't know if there's still slots. I think it's limited to 30, but you can see if you can still sign up at the registration desk. But it's a lot of fun, but you can go anytime. Like we said, it runs a lot. Which is it's a really fun piece. And so that's the company that we have specializes in making stuff like this in a way that if you have a historic site, we have to do something. We're really specific about making sure that we tailor the work for that site. Every site has its own requirements, every moment in history. And a lot of times it's finding kind of what the moment is or what's that story. So in this case, it's kind of figure out who these voices are and what is, this play really focuses on the relationship between these two people that operate in this household whose statuses shift. Like Cato starts out a slave and ends up free. And so they have a relationship that evolves over the course of 40 years together living in the same house with different levels of status. So, okay, that's our whole thing. Talk like 10 miles a minute. Do you guys have any questions? I want to leave some time for Q&A about any of the history. I know it now for the next couple months. It's all crammed in my head. Yeah.
How was this funded?
So this is funded through the museum. So the Old State House, Bostonian Society, they own that. And so, they fundraise and have donors and things like that. There's not like an overwhelming grant. So in the past, like Blood on the Snow was funded a lot through the National Park Service, was a partner for that one. That is not the case for this show, but I don't know I don't think there's like one big partner like this.
Is there more funding for things like this coming through you guys?
Blood on the Snow made it easier for them to ask people for money because it was really successful. And that institution saw such a big impact from that production that they're like, yeah, we're going to keep doing theater because it's really important for our audience and it allows us to do all kinds of things. So it's not just, it's an audience development tool. In this particular thing, they're making some strategic planning about shifting their mission to be more inclusive and making sure that it's not just the standard old stories that are told. And so this is an attempt to shift that a little bit. And they can use this kind of tool. And it's also, if you run a nonprofit, this is a good kind of donor and board development tool because it's really specific. You can bring people in. There's good things institutionally for why this works.
And I think that we're all hoping, I think the Bostonian Society and all of us from the theater community who have worked on Blood on the Snow and on this production, that the more we start doing these kinds of partnerships, the more funding opportunities will be encouraged, right? The more different grants and different organizations will be encouraged to step up and help support this kind of blending of these two different organizations, museums, historical societies, theater companies.
Yeah, I think especially for the theater community, we're providing work for actors and directors and designers that doesn't cannibalize money from the existing theater scene, which is more underfunded than the museum scene, if you can believe it, for those of you who work there. It's much worse. So I think we're finding new sources and ways to energize funders that say, oh, I get this now. Like I didn't want to give money to this historic site before, but now I do because I get what people will see from it.
For those of us who might be in South Carolina, will there be a way to see either Blood in the Snow or this play online?
There is not. There may someday be a filmed version of Blood on the Snow.
I think that is everyone's hope, is that there will someday be a filmed version of Blood on the Snow. Unfortunately, in order to do it right, it's incredibly expensive. And it comes back to the idea of funding, because yes, you can just use your iPhone and do it, but that's not actually going to give the experience, because one of the things that we discovered very quickly was that the true star of Blood on the Snow was the room, and we were all the supporting players. So unless you can truly film it in a way that supports that, you're not actually giving people the right experience, right? You're giving them an experience, but you're not giving them the experience that you're hoping they have. So it's incredibly expensive. It is something that I think everyone is hoping we will someday be able to do.
They're raising money for that.
And if anyone has any funding suggestions for that, please come talk to us.
This play is a significantly more portable play.
Yeah.
And this is a kind of play where if you had a theater group in Greenville or whatever that wanted to put this on, it's a 20-minute, I don't think you have to have the Hancock Door.
It probably
to do this
wouldn't
particular
travel.
Play.
The Doors contract is
the
very
Hancock
demanding.
Door's not going anywhere. No, well, maybe, but can't talk about that. But yeah, so sadly, maybe, but this play is portable, at least script-wise.
We have one back here, too.
Go ahead.
Could you say more about the primary sources that you used for specifically trying to figure out Cato's story?
We were able to use the wills from Thomas and Lydia Hancock. Those are super useful a little bit in terms of giving us some timeline of like when he's free and when he's not, and kind of what the conditions of his freedom are granted. We had that picture of that was a where is it?
It's a receipt from a clock.
A watch.
Jewelry fix,
yeah.
clock fixer, clockmaker.
I think this is
and it says, to my servant Cato, to John Hancock's servant Cato.
and that's in 1768, 69. So there are actual documents. Mass Historical has some stuff. It's tricky, and like we're able to track down the baptismal records from Brattle Street Church, and his 3 children are listed, and he is listed. He's baptized as an adult there. So there's little tidbits, not a ton.
We are technically at time.
All right, we're at time, but all right. You can cut, how much gap do we have?
Ladies,
10:45. All right.
we need to let that settle.
Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much.